Hey everybody, I'm Tim Cooper from National Parks at Night, and I'm back with a deeper dive into the features of Adobe's latest Lightroom release 12.3. Now, along with their usual performance enhancements, bug fixes, and support for new cameras and lenses, Adobe has several new features that are great for the night photographer. In my last video, I covered their AI noise reduction feature, which is really great. So in this video, I'll go over a couple cool updates to the local adjustments, the develop module, and a great new feature for sending smart objects into Photoshop, which I love. Now, I'm only going to be covering the topics that are really relevant to night photography, but if you want a full rundown on all of the new features, just go to the Help menu in Lightroom, choose What's New, and you'll be taken to the top new features of Adobe's website. You can click on any of the top features or scroll down to find the link to a detailed new feature summary. With that, let's jump right in. Let's start off with our local adjustments. The local adjustments haven't changed all of that much, but there's a great new addition in the masking or local adjustments area now, is the ability to work on curves. And let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to click on sky so we can adjust our sky here. And before we were limited to only exposure and contrast in these sections in here. Now these are great and they're awesome and I use them all the time. But what they've now added in is the ability to use curves as a local adjustment. This is something we've been asking for a very long time. So I'm quite glad that it's here. And the reason that this is so powerful is that you can target exactly the tones that you want to brighten or darken. And what I mean by that is, let's say I want to leave this bright area alone, but I only want to lift up the shadow areas here. What I can do is go onto the local selector or direct selector button, and I can click on the brightest point and notice that it's going to drop a point on that curve. That's my highlight value right there. Now, what I'm going to do is go up and click on this point up here, and it drops a curve down here, and you can see how this baseline relates to the histogram itself. We know that this is the brighter area of the histogram and this is the darker area of the histogram. So if you draw a straight line up through, this point is now over the shadow area. So if I lift this up, I am lifting up the shadow values and making that sky a little bit brighter. But these highlight values haven't changed at all because I have left them alone. And so while these sliders up here are very, very valuable, and like I said, I use them all the time, curves can add an extra layer of precision to your image editing. So now at this point, what I would do is continue on and maybe add a little bit of dehaze and see how that starts to pop things out. And the reason that I lifted these shadows up to begin with was because dehaze will typically darken down your shadows. And let me just bring this back to 0, and I'm going to go to hold my Alt key down and press Reset Curve, and that resets my curve here. If I just go in and hit dehaze, you can see how much the shadows are darkening down in the sky, or rather the dark areas of the sky are darkening down. So what I've just done is basically increase the dehaze and said, oh, I like the way that it's separating all of these values in here, but the shadows become too dark. Then I've gone in and said, well, I'm going to lift up the shadow regions a little bit, but now I'm also increasing my highlight some. So if I grab my direct selector, I could say, click on that image right there, click on that portion of the northern lights, and I could drag that back down. And now that remains at the same exact brightness as it did before. So in this case, I'm really just lightening up the shadow portions of my image. And you can see how much control you're getting between using curves and the other sliders that we would customarily use in this situation. So let's look at it this way, just to finish up this point here. Here is a night sky, and this is pretty dark in here. This is one that I blend in with a blue hour shot, but this is just the night sky version of it. So I could click on sky and just get the sky mask, and let's go ahead and do that. And now I'm going to go down to curve. And I want to brighten up the bright areas and leave the dark areas alone. So right now the show overlay is on and it's kind of confusing my eye a little bit. So I'll just take that off. Now I'll go to the direct selector button and click on the bright area and say, yes, click. That's the area I want to change. And you can see it's left a point on the curve. Now, with my direct selector still active, I'm going to click on the dark area. Now, at this point, I've got my 2 points on the curve. Notice that if I lift this one up, this point will stay the same, but the shadow area in here is going to drop down a little bit. So I'll pull this up, and you can see how this area has dropped down. That is not really what I want, because now it's making the darker areas below that point even darker. So hold down my Alt or Option key and reset curve. Take my overlay off. I've got my direct selector on. So I'm going to click in the shadow area and I'm going to click in the highlight area that I want to affect. But this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another point on that curve below the shadow area. Now when I move this portion of the curve up and down, there's not so much movement. I'm getting a tiny bit of movement in here. So if you want, you can put another point in there and just lower that back down to where it was. But now that shadow area is staying exactly the same. Now you have to be careful with this because you can get some weird effects, as you can see, if you overdo the curve. And that's the same way with any slider, right? Kid gloves. But now what we're doing is we have the ability to brighten our highlight values without touching any shadows whatsoever. And so I can either use this and bring this up, or what I can do is if I want my brightest whites to get whiter, which they're currently not, because that's the brightest white point on that curve right there, I could right click on this point and say delete control point. Now, when I lift up from here, when I grab this point, now my brightest whites are getting whiter as well. And the thing to look at is how far this curve or this line is moving away from the baseline. So right now, the whites are getting a lot more whiter than, say, just these highlight values in here because they've moved further away from the baseline. And I know this is really annoying. Every time I get near this thing, I get the crosshair and it's flopping back and forth, and I apologize for that. But if I was to go here and move this area up, now my highlights and my whites are equally as far from the baseline, meaning they're getting an equal amount of brightening effect. So very, very powerful, the curves dialog box. It's powerful in our regular overall processing, and now we have it in our local adjustments as well, which is a really welcome addition. So let me just say there are some problems with this box. This is a clunky box compared to the curves dialog box in Photoshop proper. And I hope someday we can come to grips with that, or they'll fix that. It's a little bit more difficult to use, but the concept is precisely the same. So when I'm in Photoshop, I use curves all the time. So big improvement there. Thank you, Adobe, for that. Now, the next one and the final topic that I want to cover today is smart objects. Now, I've been using smart objects in Photoshop since they've come out, and it's always been a bit laborious getting these all together in Photoshop. And what I mean by that is that when we are in Lightroom, we could always choose two images. So, and put them into Photoshop as layers. We do this all the time, of course, with star trails. Here, I've got Blue Hour foreground shot, and I've got the night sky shot. And I want to blend the two together. So we know that I could go to Photo, Edit In, and Open as Layers in Photoshop. This has been here since as long as I can remember. But I don't particularly care to do that because I want the ability to continue working on my raw image, even in Photoshop. So if I go to Photo, Edit In, Open as Layers in Photoshop, what's going to happen is Lightroom sends these two files over and puts them into one file. Now this is great, and this is precisely, again, like I said, what we do with star trails. And I can go and start working on these images. The problem is that they are already rasterized. These are now either Photoshop or TIFFs, and these are no longer raw. So what I would do in the past would be to go into Lightroom, go to my grid module or library module, and go to Photo, Edit in, Open as a Smart Object in Photoshop. Now, what this is going to do is open up both of these images as a smart object, meaning that they're really not technically rasterized or finished yet. They're still referencing the original raw file. The problem is they're not together in one file. So what I'd have to do is click on this and drag it down, grab my move tool, drag this over, hold down my shift key, plop it in there, and now we've got two raw images. All right, now that doesn't seem that hard with just two, but if you're doing 4 or 8 or 6 images like that, it becomes quite problematic. So this is what Adobe has done, is they have allowed us to select 2 raw images. You can see these are both NEF files, and we can go into Photo, Edit in, and all the way at the bottom we have Open as Smart Object layers in Photoshop. And I can't tell you how happy this makes me. When I click on that, these are both going to go into one file and be raw, or rather they're going to be referencing the original raw file. So let's go over here to Photoshop, and you can see it's loading them up, and that was the old image that I had already opened. So now what we have, one file, 2 raw images. Now, you may say, why do you think that's important? Well, let me tell you why. If I'm back here and I was doing it the old way, I would need to guess at how much I want to brighten or darken this foreground, and I would have to guess as to how much I want to brighten or darken the sky to make them look good together. So I might come in here and say, well, you know, the sky is a little bit dark, so maybe I need to brighten it up. Let's add some more whites and add some more exposure. And maybe this foreground is a little too dark, and so maybe I'd want to brighten that up. Who knows? But I can't see them on top of one another, so it's really difficult to guess how they're going to blend. The beauty of opening these both as smart objects is now as soon as I make my mask, I'm going to be able to see them together and make adjustments. Let me give you an example. I'm going to go in here and click on the upper image, and let's see, is that what I want to do? Yeah, let's click on the upper image, and just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to create a mask. Of course, there's a million different ways to do this. I'm just going to create a mask and paint with my black paintbrush on that mask to reveal the sky below. First, I'm going to soften my brush up quite a bit, make sure it's fully soft. Okay, it is. And then I'm just going to paint in. I'm going to check my opacity, and that's at 30%. So let's bring that up to 100 and paint this in. And something like that. All right. Now, in essence, my images are blended together. Now I can see that my background is too dark or my foreground is too light. So instead of having to close out of this and go back to Lightroom and readjust the raw files and bring them back in, all I need to do is double click right here on this little icon down here. And when I do, it brings me right back into the raw converter. Now this is Photoshop's raw converter, which looks slightly different than Lightroom's develop module, but it's the same engine, it's the same tools, it's exactly the same. So I can see that I actually clicked on the wrong image here. Let me cancel out of that. What I want to do is brighten the sky. So I double click on the sky image, and here it comes up, and I can increase my whites, I can increase my exposure, I can even increase my shadows a little bit if I want to see if I can get a better blend here. So let me open up those shadows somewhat, and let's call that good. When I say OK here, it's going to update that raw file that is now in this original file. Boom, there you go. And now we start to get a much better idea of what we need to do with each layer. So maybe, well, it's actually looking pretty good, but maybe I just need to adjust my mask a little bit. Let's soften that brush up and make it really big and kind of make a better blend just to get that area up in there. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. Now, this is a very simple example, but the idea is that we are saving a ton of work going back and forth between Lightroom and Photoshop, and we get the initial visual as soon as we make a mask, and we know which direction we have to go. So if I wanted my foreground brighter or darker here, then I could now double click on my foreground and I could say, hey, you know, maybe I want to change the color a little bit. Maybe it would look better if it was warmer and maybe a touch brighter. So let me bring up some whites. Let me bring up the exposure a little bit here. And let's say okay and see if that looks any better. I probably pushed it too far, but no, it's okay. But again, we get an instant comparison of what it looks like in real time when you open up both images as smart objects, and they remain as smart objects. So if I was to hit save and then close this file out, it of course returns to Lightroom, and here is that file. That was the original, and here's the blended file. And at any point, I could just say, yeah, you know, I think I might want to make a subtle change to this. Maybe it needs a little bit more warmth in this foreground. All I need to do is click on that image and choose Photo, Edit in Photoshop. Now it's going to ask me, hey, do you want to make a copy of this file, a copy with Lightroom adjustments, or the original? And in this case, I want the original because the original refers to this file that I've clicked on. All right, so I'm going to click Edit. It launches back into Photoshop, and here's my smart object. So I just double click on that. It brings me back into the raw converter, and whoops, I did that again. I hit the wrong image. Now I want this one. I want the foreground image. So I'm going to double click on it and maybe warm it up just a hair, and just for good measure, we'll brighten it up just so we can see the change, but it's probably bright as fine as it was, but okay. And there it is. All right. So the ability to open two images as smart objects into one file, or as layers in Lightroom parlance, is a huge, huge boon for us night photographers. Let's look at one more example. Another blue hour blend. Here you can see that this image was shot at the blue hour, and it's overly bright. I do have darker images, but I chose this one just to show you all the effect. And then left my camera set up, waited for the astronomical twilight, and then photographed the Milky Way. All right, so let's grab both of these images, and we're going to go to Photo, Edit in, Open as Smart Objects. Open as Smart Object Layers in Photoshop. That verbiage still seems a little weird to me. And that will launch those two images into Photoshop, and here they are. Now, once again, I could do a simple paintbrush, or I could do a select sky. It doesn't matter which image is on the top or the bottom. There's ways to go about it in either way. But let's start on this one and click on this image and go to Select Sky. All right. And now what we're going to do is just go down and create a mask. Now, that's just the opposite of what I want. So I've got two choices. Number one, I can hit Command or Control on a PC, I, so Command I, and that just flip-flops the mask. Or what I could do is hit Command or Control Z, go back to the selection, and choose Select Inverse. And now when I create the mask, it'll be correct. So two different ways to go about it. All right, now we can see this looks entirely fake, primarily because the foreground is just simply way too bright, but not a problem, right? We just double click on the foreground image and we say, whoa, that was way too bright. Let's darken that down a little bit. And then click OK. Immediately it gets better. All right. Now I can begin to fine tune this. So I think it's maybe a hair blue. I'm seeing a lot of warmth up in the sky, but you know what? Let's work on our sky first. So I'm going to go ahead and double click now on the sky layer. And what I'm going to do is just do what I normally do on skies and Milky Ways. Increase the dehaze a little bit. Increase the whites somewhat here. And maybe even the exposure a little bit more. All right, now I'm seeing it's kind of a purplish blue color. So I can decide if I want to alter my color balance in it. Let's take some magenta out of that. Maybe add a little bit more blue by bringing that down. And let's call that good for now. So I'll click OK. And we get our immediate preview. And that's looking pretty good to me. But this still looks a little off. And I'm thinking it's because it's too saturated. If we zoom in here and we look at that background, that's way too saturated up against that night sky, which is not as saturated. So what I can do, double click on my foreground layer and say, no, thank you, too much saturation. Let's just back off on that a little bit. And then click OK. And now the image is starting to look a little bit more realistic. And then at any point, of course, we could go up and start working on our masks. I'm just doing simple masks to show you how to blend, but of course, blending blue hour foregrounds with night skies, there's a lot more to it. I've chosen some simple images to get the point across as to why it's so important to bring these into Photoshop as smart objects. All right, well, thank you so much, Adobe, and thank you all so much for watching. Hope you found that helpful. Remember, as always, we welcome constructive feedback. So if you feel so inclined, drop us a note in the comment section below. And don't forget to like and subscribe while you're down there. Also consider signing up for our weekly blog posts at nationalparksatnight.com/blog. They're pretty awesome, and you'll get to see a lot more content like this video. If you want free information on learning more about night photography, this is the place to go. And if you're looking for more of an outdoor adventure, check out our workshops. You can find us at this URL right here. Again, I'm Tim Cooper from National Parks at Night. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you all next time.